It's a pleasure to be with you once again for this final lecture in our series, Brazil Beneath the Surface. I mentioned at the beginning of the semester that the genesis for this series was an article that appeared in ESPN magazine last summer that was trafficking in gross stereotypes about Brazil, and I read the article and was frustrated about the way in which Brazil is so often reduced to particular stereotypes, and began thinking about, well, what could we do at BYU to address that, and that's how we began thinking about this series, Brazil Beneath the Surface. Can we move beneath the surface of stereotypes about Brazil? I'm particularly pleased to introduce our final speaker today, Professor Fred Williams. When I think about Fred, a quote that often comes to mind is a quote from Richard Morris, well-respected historian of Brazil. And this is about 25 years ago. He gave a famous paper entitled "Brazilianists, God bless them, what in the world is to be done?" He had some problems with the term Brazilianist, specialists in Brazil. But in this article, he said something that I really like about what the goal of a Brazilianist might be. He says, quote, "We seek to recapture at least a pale semblance of the spirit of de Tocqueville, looking at the United States as we now look at Brazil. He refrained from imposing French categories, although not from drawing on inherited wisdom, and instead inquired what messages this raw and turbulent nation might have for the rest of the West." When I think about Fred, I think he's someone who embodies this perfectly, someone who has a deep understanding and love for Brazil and Brazilian culture, Brazilian history, someone who has refrained from imposing a North American theoretical framework on his own understanding of Brazil, but who has opened himself to Brazil and consequently has not only learned much, but been able to offer much to our understanding of Brazil. Professor Williams is the Gerrit de Jong Jr. Distinguished Professor of Luso-Brazilian Studies at Brigham Young University. He serves as a faculty affiliate of the Kennedy Center and has previously served on the advisory board for both BYU Studies and the Kennedy Center's international study programs. For 27 years, he taught at the University of California in both Los Angeles and Santa Barbara. And he held a variety of prestigious academic positions, including chairman of the department and director of the Jorge de Sena Center for Portuguese Studies. Professor Williams and his wife, Carol, opened and presided over the São Paulo Interlagos mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they most recently served as president and matron of the Recife, Brazil Temple. His publications include over 50 scholarly articles and 22 volumes. These include studies on such diverse topics as the Brazilian poet Sozandrigi, the history of the church in South America, Portuguese author Jorge de Sena, plus a series of bilingual translations featuring the poets of all 10 nations and regions of the world whose official language is Portuguese. Professor Williams received a BA in Hispanic Civilization from Brigham Young University and an MA and PhD in Portuguese with a minor in Spanish from the University of Wisconsin. Please join with me in welcoming him today.
Rex is very fine. Can you hear this? Thank you all for coming, especially the students of the class, because it's very hard to get an A in the class if you didn't come to this. I'd like to start with the religious landscape of Brazil. 5 religious traditions have flourished in Brazil that predate the establishment of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the 20th century. Native American animism, Roman Catholicism, African spiritualism, Protestant sectarianism, and Judaism. These 5 came together in Brazil during the 16th century and early 17th centuries during the Age of Discovery. It is estimated that there were about 1 million Indians in Brazil when the Portuguese arrived, which closely matched the population of Portugal itself. When discovered in 1500 by the Indian-bound fleet of Portuguese navigator Pedro Álvares Cabral, the native inhabitants of Brazil were divided into numerous tribes and languages, many of which continue to this day in greater numbers than ever before. Tupi and Guarani were the two most widely spoken languages and were mutually understood since they were from the same language group. Generally speaking, Tupi was spoken by the tribes living along the coast, and Guarani was spoken by the tribes living in the forests of the interior, as far south as today's Paraguay, Uruguay, northern Bolivia, and northern Argentina. For purposes of Christianizing the Indians, the early Catholic priests learned Tupi-Guarani and used it as their lingua franca. Jesuit priests like Father José de Anchieta developed a written language for it, prepared dictionaries and grammars, translated many Christian texts, and wrote plays in Tupi-Guarani that were used in teaching the Indians. The native beliefs included a rich pantheon of gods, chief among them Tupã, whom the Europeans associated with God the Father, and Anhanguera, whom they likened unto the devil. The first Roman Catholics to live in Brazil were not priests, but young Portuguese mariners who immediately paired up with the Indian women, producing a large number of half-caste children. Rather than introduce Christianity in European manners to the Indians, these Portuguese readily chose to adopt Indian dress, language, and customs. For more than 50 years following Brazil's discovery, there were no churches, no religious congregations, no schools, and no one to preach the gospel until the Jesuit priests were sent there to address the situation. Father Anchieta was born in the Canary Islands, and he went to Brazil when he was 19 as a Jesuit priest and began this very interesting and exciting adventure of teaching the gospel to people who didn't want to hear it. The unnamed conditions in the New World conjured up associations that compared favorably with the biblical Garden of Eden. The wilds of Brazil, however, were not limited to the flora and fauna, or even to the Indian populations. As daunting as these could be, the most impenetrable challenges Anchieta faced were the very European newcomers, more often than not already marginalized members of the society recently released from prison, and the growing half-caste population. Neither of these groups saw any need to abide by the European societal or religious conventions in the new lands. The second group, the African spiritualists, it is estimated that 4 million black Africans were shipped to Brazil as slaves over a period of some 300 years. They were primarily from Angola and Mozambique, and they invariably brought their religions with them. Most were animists and spiritualists, but some of the Mozambican slaves were also Muslims, and they could read and write, and they often served as teachers. The Catholic Church outlawed the religious practices of the spiritualists, but the slaves very cleverly found a way around that proscription by using syncretism, or in other words, by matching their African deities to the Catholic saints. They could thus feign that their prayers were being offered to Christian saints when in reality they were praying to their African gods. Iemanjá, one of the 7 orishas of the African pantheon, became associated with the Virgin Mary, and Yansan was said to be Santa Bárbara. In today's Brazil, spiritualism is a widespread and vibrant religion whose most popular forms among those of African descent are candomblé and macumba. While among the whites and the upper classes, there is a sizable following of the spiritualist teachings of 19th century French educator Allan Kardec. The first Protestants in Brazil were the French Huguenots, who in 1555 helped establish the colony of Antarctic France in what is today Rio de Janeiro. Later in 1612, the French founded the colony of Equinoctial France in Maranhão and named their capital Saint-Louis after the French king. The French formed alliances with various Indian tribes in order to do battle against the Portuguese and their allies. The second group of Protestants in Brazil were from Holland, whose country conquered the northeastern states of Brazil in 1630 and established their capital in Recife, Pernambuco. During their 24 years of sovereignty, they established plantations, constructed bridges and fortifications, built stately homes, and a sizable urban center. But their most lasting cultural contribution came when Governor Maurits of Nassau enhanced the Dutch colony with the presence of some 30 scholars and specialists, including 2 gifted painters, Albert van Eekhout, a pupil of Rembrandt, and Frans Post. As the first artists to capture on canvas the varied scenes of the New World, their works gave Europeans their initial views of the flora, fauna, and inhabitants of Brazil. The third group are the Jews. In the late 15th and early 17th centuries, Portugal decreed that her Muslim and Jewish subjects must convert to Christianity or leave the nation and their possessions behind. Many chose to be baptized and became known as New Christians. The majority of the Jews, however, left the country and fled to Protestant Holland, which was more accepting and tolerant. When Holland took possession of the northeast of Brazil, many of these former Portuguese Jews came to the New World. They already spoke Portuguese, where they became plantation owners, slave traders, doctors, and merchants. The community expanded when they were joined by Marrano Christians or crypto Jews already living in Brazil, until approximately 50% of the white population of Recife was of the House of Israel. They established the first Jewish community and synagogue in all of the Americas. Today in Recife, we can see the mikvah, or ritual cleansing pool, and other features of the original synagogue, which today is a Jewish cultural center in the middle of the old Jewish quarter. When the Dutch were expelled from Recife by the Portuguese in 1654, one group of 23 Portuguese, Dutch, Brazilian Jews found refuge in Governor Peter Stuyvesant's New Amsterdam, thus becoming not only the first Jewish settlers in what would become the United States, but the first Portuguese as well. Their cemetery in New York dates from 1655, and some of the Portuguese inscriptions on the headstones are still legible. There is an interesting Mormon connection to these New York Portuguese Jews. 3 generations later, it was from this Sephardic Jewish community that Joseph Smith sought a Hebrew teacher. He first contacted Dr. Daniel Maduro Peixoto, who did not work out, and then Professor Josué Seixas, a cousin by marriage to Peixoto, who taught the brethren Hebrew at the School of the Prophets in the Kirtland Temple in early 1836. Both Peixoto and Seixas' ancestors were originally from Portugal and then had gone to Holland. Now we're moving into the 19th and 20th centuries. When the British established economic hegemony in Brazil in the early 19th century, they were allowed to establish a congregation of the Church of England, but were not permitted to proselytize. In the latter half of the 19th century, Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist ministers from the recently defeated Confederate South came to Brazil as exiles. They established their principal community and churches in a settlement they called Americana, near the city of Santa Bárbara do Oeste in the state of São Paulo. It is interesting to point out that beginning in the late 1940s, some third-generation members of these Brazilian Southerners were contacted by LDS missionaries, and several joined the church. Their knowledge of English was a great help in the early stages of translating church literature, including the first hymnal into Portuguese. Of the approximately 100 descendants of Baptist minister Elijah H. Quillen, fully 50% became members of the Mormon Church. Every national and ethnic group that immigrated to Brazil in the 19th and 20th centuries, most of whom established their communities in the southern half of the country, brought their religious leaders with them as well. These included German Lutheran ministers, Greek Orthodox priests, Russian Jewish rabbis, Japanese Buddhist monks, Lebanese Christian pastors, and Arab Muslim clerics. In the latter half of the 20th and early 21st centuries, evangelical Christian churches have proliferated in Brazil and are especially popular among the rural and urban poor of the Northeast. It may not be surprising to learn that independent thinking Brazil, in addition to having formed its own separate Catholic church, has also formed its own Protestant evangelical church, the latter being particularly aggressive in its proselytizing efforts at home and abroad in Portuguese-speaking Africa, Europe, and in Spanish-speaking communities in the United States, particularly in Texas and California. Now we're going to test you. If asked, who was the first Brazilian to attend a Mormon sacrament meeting? Most members could not answer the question, but I will. It was Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil. And by so doing, he fulfilled an early prophecy by Brigham Young. After enduring the harsh winter of 1848 and 49 in the Salt Lake Valley, there was concern among some members regarding the wisdom of establishing the city in the middle of nowhere. Brigham Young stood before the people and said, "God has shown me that this is the spot to locate his people, and here is where they will prosper. He will temper the elements for the good of the saints. He will extend our settlements to the east and west, to the north and to the south, and we will build towns and cities by the hundreds, and thousands of the saints will gather in from the nations of the earth. This will become the great highway of the nations. Kings and emperors and nobles and the wise of the earth will visit us here." Dom Pedro came to the United States in 1876 at the invitation of President Ulysses S. Grant as an official guest of the nation for the centennial celebration. One of the first reigning monarchs to visit the U.S., Dom Pedro and his party, which included his wife, Empress Teresa Cristina, and his daughter, Princess Isabel, caused much excitement as he traveled about the country, savoring the food and meeting the people, while at the same time expanding his knowledge of scientific achievements, including the telephone. Every facet of his visit was reported in the New York Herald and in the Brazilian press via the submarine cable linking North and South America that had been especially constructed by the Herald to follow the monarch's every move. Of an inquisitive mind, he desired to visit the industrious Mormons in Salt Lake City. Contacts were made, and Brigham Young was happy and extended an invitation. The royal family arrived Saturday and attended a program at the Salt Lake Theater, where the Brazilian national anthem was played and the Brazilian flag displayed. The next day, Sunday, they attended sacrament meeting in the 14th Ward, where the principal speaker was Apostle John Taylor. Dom Pedro received a good impression of the Mormons and took several church books and other printed materials with him back to Brazil. Second question, this is still a test. If asked who was the first Brazilian poet to reference the Mormons in his poetry, even fewer members could answer that one. But again, I will. It was Joaquim de Souza Andrade, or Sozandrade, his agglutinated pen name. Sozandrade, a romantic poet, was born into an aristocratic slave-holding family on a plantation near Alcântara in the state of Maranhão. He studied literature at the Sorbonne and engineering at the School of Mines in Paris. He later lived in the United States over a period of about 10 years, between 1871 and 1878, and again between 1880 and 1882. His Brazilian audience, he made these cryptic references to U.S. life and business, and he satirizes religious hypocrisy in ironic stanzas. In addition to referencing Protestant and Catholic figures, some stanzas refer to Brigham Young and Mormon polygamy. But there's an irony here. His Brazilian audience could read the poem in its original Portuguese, but they could not appreciate nor follow the references to American politics and popular culture. His American readers, although familiar with the topical references, could not read Portuguese. So in the end, the work of this poet was overlooked and forgotten until he was discovered in the 1960s by the concrete poets. Apostle Polly P. Pratt is the first Mormon to proselytize in South America. Here we are on the deep, bound for Chile. Thus begins Polly P. Pratt's letter to his family, dated on board the Henry Kelsey, September 15, 1851. A few months before, Apostle Pratt had been called as president of the Pacific Mission. Just think about that for a minute. An immense field of labor which included, as he explained, quote, all the islands and coasts of the Pacifics, end quote, with unofficial headquarters in San Francisco. An account of President Pratt's trip to the Pacific coast of South America with his wife and his companion, Elder Rufus C. Allen, their residency in Valparaiso, Chile, their lengthy stopover in Peru on the return voyage, and his observations of the people, the cultures, and the Catholic faith are chronicled in his autobiography. He felt, though, that the time was not right to establish the church in that region of the world. The first Mormons in Spanish South America and in Portuguese Brazil were Germans. The first known member were Max Richard and Amelia Augusta Zapf, who arrived from Germany in 1913 with their 4 children, and they went to live in the German settlement of Colony Müller, Santa Catarina, in southern Brazil. They would have no contact with the church for 27 years until they were found by the missionaries in 1930. Wilhelm Friedrichs and Emil Hoppe had also been converted to the gospel in Germany. Conditions in their homeland were precariously difficult after World War I, and hoping for a better future, they emigrated with their families in 1923 to Buenos Aires. Even before leaving Germany, they had been in contact with church headquarters in Salt Lake City, corresponding with presiding Bishop Charles W. Nibley, who spoke German. Once in Argentina, they asked that missionaries be sent and reported that they had interested some of their fellow German immigrants in the gospel, and a few of them were desirous of baptism. Robert Friedrich Heinrich Lippelt also decided to move his family out of Germany after the chaos of World War I. But his primary reason for leaving was to escape the Mormon Church, which his wife, Auguste Kuhlmann Lippelt, and his children had joined. He chose to take his family not to Argentina, but to Brazil, thinking that there would be no Mormons there. His wife, however, had brought from Germany the Salt Lake address of the president of the church, Heber J. Grant. And soon after the Lippelts arrived in Ipomeya, Santa Catarina, in the winter of 1924, she wrote to the church headquarters asking that missionaries be sent. He was not pleased. The establishment of the church occurs under the hands of Melvin J. Ballard. Church President Heber J. Grant was persuaded by the importuning of these German saints and carefully considered who should be sent. He called Apostle Melvin J. Ballard to preside over the opening of the South American mission, which included the whole continent, with headquarters in Buenos Aires. Since Elder Ballard, who had just turned 52, did not speak either German or Spanish, President Grant assigned 2 other general authorities to accompany him: the 71-year-old German-speaking Elder Rulon S. Wells and the 58-year-old Spanish-speaking Rael Pratt, both of the Council of 70. Elder Pratt was the grandson of Apostle Parley P. Pratt and had been the president of the Mexican mission before his call as a general authority. A farewell banquet in honor of the departing brethren was held in the Beehive House on October 28, 1925, attended by 140 people, including President Heber J. Grant, his counselor Anthony W. Ivins, as well as many members of the Council of the 12. Apostle Orson F. Whitney first gave a humorous reading, then a serious speech. In their honor, Ruth Mae Fox composed an original poem, which was read by Preston Nibley. In response to the good wishes everyone had shared, Elder Ballard expressed his determination to do his best to further the cause of the Lord in that new land. He said, quote, "Everything that is in me, with God's help, I will give to this new mission. But I know that I cannot succeed without God's help. I go, and I will stay as long as the brethren want me to stay." He dedicated the whole South American continent early on Christmas morning, a beautiful, warm, and sunny summer day. It was in the 3 de Febrero Park near the banks of the La Plata River. They sang hymns, the morning breaks, Hail to the Brightness, and An Angel from on High, just the three of them. Brother Melvin J. Ballard was an excellent singer. President Pratt read from the Book of Mormon. President Wells read from the Bible. And Elder Ballard offered the dedicatory prayer, after which they sang Praise to the Man. Before they left, in July, on July 4th, a very cold day of 1926, the few German saints that had been baptized, and these two now, because one had gone home, joined together with the new mission president, who is Reinhold Stoff, a German, with his wife. Had the other Americans in Argentina or Brazil known about this little group, they probably could not have cared less. Mormonism was something most of them could easily do without. All present at that meeting wore woolen clothing, extra socks, and overcoats against the chill winter air. The speaker was Apostle Melvin J. Ballard, and he spoke slowly in short English sentences, giving ample time for his thoughts to be translated by President Reinhold Stoff, the German brother newly arrived to replace Elder Ballard as president of the mission. The words were recorded by American missionary Elder James Vernon Sharp, who with his American companion Waldo Stoddard had arrived with President Stoff and his wife. Elder Ballard, in his remarks, prophesied the guidelines for the expansion of the church on the South American continent. I quote, "The work will go forth slowly for a time, just as the oak grows slowly from an acorn. It will not shoot up in a day, as does the sunflower, that grows quickly and thus dies. Thousands will join here. It will be divided into more than one mission, and will be one of the strongest in the church. The work here is the smallest that it will ever be. The day will come," well, I'll stop there. But that's why, from Acorn to Oak Tree. The first missionaries. This is December 14th, 1927. The entire missionary force of the whole South American continent. The mission president, Reinhold Stoff, and Elder Waldo Stoddard sailed from Buenos Aires on board the SS Sierra for Santos, Brazil. Elder Stoddard paid his own way. From there, they traveled to São Paulo, where they spent a week gathering information about Germans living in Brazil. Hundreds of thousands had immigrated to Brazil beginning in the 1870s, where they cleared trees, planted crops, and established small businesses and sawmills, and constructed comfortable frame homes with steep roofs similar to the ones they had known in their homeland, even though there was little danger of heavy snowfall. President Stolf learned that many Germans lived in São Paulo, but they were scattered in much the same way they were in Buenos Aires. So he and his companion took a small coastal steamer to São Francisco do Sul and a train to Joinville. They stayed at a pensão, or boarding house, in Joinville and other villages of German-speaking people, and made many contacts. Brother Stolf, who had been a school teacher in Germany, lectured on the church before a crowd of 142 people in Joinville, and he received favorable comments that were published in the newspaper. They also traveled to Blumenau, another small agricultural community, where they expected to find 2 Mormons. However, one had died, and the other, out of work and discouraged with the death of his friend, had returned to Germany. The work is opened in Brazil on September 12, 1928, when he, President Stolf, and Elder Heinz and Elder Schindler left Buenos Aires for Brazil. They thought that they would go to Joinville to start the church, these agricultural communities, but there was a terrible storm, and they couldn't stop to put the small ships down to get to land. And so they prayed about it and said, well, if the Lord wants us to start in Joinville, the storm will stop. If not, we'll go to São Paulo and start it there. They did go to Joinville and immediately prepared to give an illustrated lecture on Utah and its people, which drew an audience of more than 400 people. That's very nice. 400 people when it was presented on September 21st, 1928. This initial meeting with over 400 people present indicated how right President Stolf's decision had been to begin missionary work in Joinville. It wasn't a bed of roses, however. The Protestant ministers started their attacks against the church and putting it in the newspapers. The first baptism in Brazil in the church occurred on April 14th, 1929, one day before Elder Heinz returned home after completing his mission. The circumstances surrounding the baptism included a special blessing and a healing. On the 31st of March, after the evening service, I'm quoting, a woman, Mrs. Bertha Sell, who attended the meeting, dropped down in the garden because of a sickness. The elders, Schindler and Heinz, administered to her in the presence of several of her friends. The next morning, she visited the elders, being well, and asked for baptism. For several months, there had only been 4 missionaries serving in the entire South American mission. 2 were working in Buenos Aires, and 2 in Joinville, Brazil. With the departure of Elder Heinz from Brazil, the mission was now down to only 3 missionaries for the entire continent. President Stolf asked senior missionary Frederick S. Williams, my father, to extend his 2-year mission by an additional 6 months, or until a new missionary arrived. And he requested that upon his return to the States, he would take supplies to Elder Schindler in Joinville and stay with him for a time so that he would have a companion again. Elder Williams served for 29 months and did travel to Joinville on his return home, thus becoming one of the very few missionaries to serve in both districts of the South American mission, Argentina and Brazil. In 1935, 10 years after it was begun, the South American mission was disbanded, and 2 new missions were created, one in Argentina, the other in Brazil. President Heber J. Grant called Rulon S. Howes to be the first president of the Brazilian mission, which was organized on his birthday. When his mission began, there were 7 missionaries laboring in 3 Brazilian districts: Joinville, with 80 members of the church, Santa Catarina, with 30 members, and Porto Alegre, with 3 members, for a total membership of 113 members in all of Brazil. President Howes had served a mission in Germany between 1922 and 1925, and he had just graduated from the University of Utah Law School prior to leaving for Brazil in April with his wife, a gifted soprano. The Brazilian consul in New Orleans would not grant them a visa as missionaries, but they were granted a tourist visa with the privilege of renewing it in 6 months. That's been a pattern ever since. I can't get a visa. Daniel J. Shoup and Mário Pedroso and the Portuguese Book of Mormon. The Howes were met in Rio de Janeiro by Daniel Shoup, formerly of Ogden, who had filled a mission in France. And he had been sent to Rio de Janeiro, the capital of Brazil, as a U.S. Embassy employee. After having left the embassy, he was at that time employed by a newspaper. Brother Shoup had married a Brazilian girl in Rio and was a great help to President Howes. Although his wife nor any member of her family were members of the church, they nevertheless made a great contribution to the early beginnings of the church in Brazil by helping Brother Shoup with the translation of the Book of Mormon that President Howes had requested. President Howes had also requested that a Brazilian translate the Book of Mormon, Mário Pedroso, who he had met in a bookstore. And he did. Neither group knew of the other's work. And when it was finally published, they took the best of both and had it published. No place or city had been designated as the headquarters of the new mission by the First Presidency. That decision would be left up to the new president, President Howes. He's traveled extensively around the most populated sections of Brazil and then chose São Paulo. So we're shifting from an agricultural area to an urban center. And he is also the president who shifts the work from German to Portuguese. All the missionary work up to that time had been carried on in rural southern Brazilian towns among the German-speaking citizenry. In April of 1938, he assigned the first missionaries to work exclusively in the Portuguese language. These were Elder Grant Leroy Brooks and Melvin Harold Morris. They were assigned to Campinas to take up their labors. And to aid in their efforts, President Howes had several church tracts printed in Portuguese. During this period, just before the German invasion and the World War II that followed, several missionaries who were working in the Portuguese area became later general authorities. So war is good. Among the missionaries who arrived in 1939 assigned to work in Portuguese, 2 would later become general authority. James E. Faust, of course, second counselor to President Gordon B. Hinckley in the First Presidency, and William Grant Bangerter, assistant to the 12 Apostles and a member of the Presidency of the 70. After their missions were completed, both served in the Army Air Corps, and at the conclusion of the war, both were discharged with the rank of first lieutenant, married, and pursued their university studies. In later years, as general authorities, they would both serve as area presidents in Brazil. During the war, no missionaries were sent to either Brazil or Argentina. In 1949, President Rulon Howes was again sent to preside over the mission in Brazil. He had been the Assistant Attorney General of the state of Utah in 1940, and from 46 to 49 had served as Commissioner of Publicity and industrial development for the state of Utah. While he was in Washington, D.C., he met up with the ambassador of Brazil to the United States and received from him letters of introduction to the governors of 4 major states in Brazil, and to newspaper people. And this opened up the work in a tremendous way. Under his second mission, President Howells called the first Brazilians to serve as missionaries. And the first was Alfredo Lima Vaz from Campinas in 1946. He would later study here at Brigham Young and teach Portuguese in the modern language department. In November 1949, he called the first American lady missionaries assigned to any mission in South or Central America, and they came to Brazil. These were Sister Dion Crane of Harriman and Sister Rhea Horton of Los Angeles, California. Brother Howells had a great ace up his sleeve with his wife. She was an excellent singer and sang with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. Also during this period, he decided to start bringing in people who could be of importance to the general public. One of these was Gerrit de Jong, who came as part of the USIA program in Santos, Brazil. And he would later become the head of the Portuguese section at Brigham Young University. And of course, the de Jong Concert Hall is named after him. It was also during Brother Howell's second presidency that he capitalized on another ace, and that was basketball. The University of Utah had just won in 1949 the NIT basketball championship. And so he went to the Corinthians Sports Club, the largest in membership in Brazil, and asked them to bring the University of Utah basketball group, and they did come. They came with the president of the university, A. Ray Open, with Coach Vidal Peterson, and the entire team. And all their expenses were paid by Corinthians. Many pictures were taken, many stories were printed. The newspapers were filled with these. I didn't put in theirs, but the next year in 1950, he brought the Brazilian, the BYU basketball team, who that year had won the NIT championship. There were outstanding All-American players on the team, and they would go on to win, as I say, the 1950-51 NIT tournament. More favorable publicity was obtained with their visit. The fine sportsmanlike conduct of the players drew cheers from the onlookers. In one game played in São Paulo, over 10,000 people watched the game. Most Brazilians apparently had never seen a basketball dunked. But when Big Mel Hutchins, a future 8-year NBA player, would jump high enough to push the ball in the basket, the audience would gasp and applaud. During the halftime, a missionary sextet sang 6 to 8 numbers. This was also new to the Brazilians, who never had had any kind of entertainment at the halftime. Now the growth is very fast. Although the oak tree would not gain stature and height until much later, the gospel acorn that Apostle Ballard had planted and prophesied would grow slowly and now was beginning to emerge as a deep-rooted sapling. In 1954, President David O. McKay became the first church president to visit Brazil. The second Brazilian mission was opened in 1959. But at the end of the 1950s, a span of 30 years of missionary work in Brazil, membership totaled only 3,700. Then came the so-called new era of missionary work throughout the 1960s, and the first Brazilian stake was organized in 1966 with German-born Walter Spaht as the president. Also in the 60s and early 70s, American returned missionaries from Brazil became the first members of the church to obtain their doctorates in Portuguese from prestigious universities, and began teaching at Brigham Young University, the University of California, and Rutgers University. You can guess who those were. By the time the São Paulo Temple was dedicated in 78, the first temple in all of South America and the 17th constructed by the church, membership had reached 54,000. After 1978, in part due to the revelation extending priesthood to all worthy males, church growth became extraordinary. The first Brazilian called to be a general authority was Hélio da Rocha Camargo in 1985. The first general authority of African descent was Brazilian Elvésio Martins, sustained in 1990. In that same year, church membership exceeded 300,000, and as the 1990s ended, membership totaled more than 700,000. The number of missions and stakes multiplied. The number of Brazilians called as missionaries grew exponentially, and the church's second largest missionary training center was dedicated in São Paulo in 1997. How many went there? Brazilian missionaries and mission presidents regularly served not only throughout Brazil, but in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the United States. The church also began to be noted in the Brazilian press for a variety of reasons, including the fight against drug trafficking and corruption by Moroni Torgan, a dynamic member of the church elected to the Brazilian Congress. And for the success of prominent businessmen such as Gelson Pizirani, vice president of TAM Airlines, and of Brazilian-born David Neeleman, president of Azul Airlines, and most especially for the outreach humanitarian Helping Hands initiatives. A total of 9 Brazilians have been called as general authorities. There are more active general authorities serving from Brazil than from any other country except the United States. 6 temples have been dedicated, with 2 more announced, while church membership has reached well over 1 million by 2012. Today, Brazil has an estimated population of some 200 million, and 1 in every 187 Brazilians is a member of the church. Truly, the oak tree has seen remarkable growth. I don't think I can read the end of it, but it's marvelous. And I've been privileged to be a witness to that. Thank you.
And if you wouldn't mind, there's a microphone over here on the side, so if you have a question, go over there, so that will help us with the filming, since this is being filmed. But please ask your questions to Professor Williams.
I'll ask a question. Who was the first poet to reference the Mormons in his poetry? Who was the first Brazilian to attend a Mormon sacrament meeting? Oh. No question. How many served in Brazil?
You mentioned that in the 1950s, in the late 50s, there was a new era that swept through Brazil. How would you define the new era? What was the difference that led to that?
That's a very good question. And it's probably best explained that that's when the Lord said, now. I served as a missionary in that time, and my president was President Bangerter. And he said, the Lord, I Can't answer you. But all of a sudden, we knew that the Lord had sent us and that we had a mission to perform. And so we were confident in expressing the message. And people were receptive and joined the church.
Thank you.
We have some Brazilian members here from the Northeast. The very first member of the church to join the church in the Northeast was Brother Soares. And 2 of my companions had been sent to Recife, and they had no success until Elder Dunn's ward in the States held a fast. And then they found Brother Soares, found his wife sweeping the porch. Anyway, he was taught the gospel. He became the first branch president, the first district president. His sons became Area 70s stake presidents. And one is still an area president, Mozart Soares. And the older one is the sealer in the Recife temple. But there were no members, and now suddenly in the Recife temple district, 73 stakes, 10 districts, people coming all the time. Incredible. Levante a mão, os Homocas. Here we have 2 people from Recife who Brother Homoka served as stake president 2, 3 times. 2 times. His parents were Austrian, and he joined the church. And Sister Homoka, although she's not truly from Pernambuco, she's from close by. And we have another Northeasterner here, Caroline. Tell them where you're from.
Maceió.
Maceió.